Hello everyone, I'm Sergo, an employee at the National Bank of Georgia and a Level 1 student at the Global Forecasting School. In today's podcast, I will be discussing the analytical framework we utilize at the Global Forecasting School to examine and assess fiscal policy. The analytical framework we use is based on overlapping generation models that we refer to as non-Ricardian. The term Ricardian was coined after the famous economist David Ricardo. So, what does it mean to be Ricardian? In a world where the government runs deficits, people who experience the low taxes associated with those deficits realize that at some point in the future, when those deficits accumulate into higher levels of government debt, taxes will have to rise to pay the interest obligations on that debt. If people today, benefiting from lower taxes, recognize that they'll face higher taxes in the future, they might save the extra money they're getting now. If they do this perfectly and care about all future tax liabilities, whether for themselves, their offspring, or future generations, then a fiscal deficit would have no effect on the economy. In this Ricardian scenario, people would simply save today's tax cuts to cover tomorrow's tax hikes. Empirically, there are surveys of the literature that cover extensive work on whether or not the world is Ricardian. These summary papers have reached different conclusions. From a policymaker's point of view, it's probably best to assume the world is not Ricardian. Now, when one look across countries, one can observe twin deficits. In an open economy, an increase in the fiscal deficit, assuming the country can borrow at an unchanged foreign interest rate and that the country risk premium doesn't change, leads to pretty close twin deficits. However, in cases where government debt is already high and markets are concerned about the country's risk, the risk premium rises. If the government continues with an expansionary fiscal policy, raising deficits further, it could increase the risk premium, limiting how much the fiscal deficit is transmitted into the current account deficit. In this case, foreign investors will charge higher interest rates if they perceive the country's debt as potentially unsustainable. So what is our approach to fiscal policy? When developing fiscal frameworks, we look beyond baseline projections to consider potential risks to government revenues or expenditures. For example, one of the recent projects with the World Bank by Douglas Laxton and Heikas Igitian involved studying the implications of aging populations in countries like Japan, where declining workforces and aging populations present long-term challenges. Unless Japan adopts a more active immigration policy, the number of workers will continue to decline, making it harder to support the elderly. The Global Integrated Monetary and Fiscal Model, originally developed at the IMF by a team including Michael Kumhoff, Douglas Laxton and Susanna Mersula, integrates monetary and fiscal policies on a global scale. It's based on overlapping generation models, building on foundational work by Olivier Blanchard in 1985. Over time, this model has been extended to incorporate life cycle income profiles. In terms of macroeconomic behavior, there are three types of distortionary taxes in the model: capital taxes, labor taxes, and VAT. Capital taxes are naturally more distortionary for output. The implication is that if a country has a significant debt problem, it should rely more on VAT rather than capital taxes. Capital taxes reduce potential output, while high labor taxes can also lower potential output. VAT, being a tax on consumption goods, encourages saving, which might help expand output in the long run. Additionally, VAT allows for the possibility of government investment, such as infrastructure, which can contribute to productive government absorption. The model also distinguishes between productive and unproductive government absorption. For example, when the government uses resources like labor or investment goods for infrastructure, this could have productive outcomes. Such models offer insight into transitions between different steady states. They present a richer perspective than infinite horizon representative agent models, which don't address real-world phenomena like interest rates or why countries might run permanent current account deficits. For example, If the US runs deficits and builds up debt, it has global implications due to its significant share of the world economy. A reduction in fiscal savings, known as a deficit, affects global savings and interest rates if the private sector doesn't fully offset the government's reduced savings. In models assuming a Ricardian world, these effects are often missed, but models like the Global Integrated Monetary and Fiscal GIMF model account for them. Such models show that real interest rates need to rise to balance global savings and investment. GIMF can highlight how a large economy like the US impacts global savings and interest rates compared to smaller economies. The GIMF has been applied in many settings. Before Douglas Laxton left the IMF, he and colleagues from institutions like the European Commission, the ECB, the Federal Reserve, and the Bank of Canada worked on a paper that mapped out fiscal experiments. One of the key conclusions was that there's no single fiscal multiplier. It depends on the type of fiscal instrument used and whether monetary policy accommodates it. For example, if the government increases its absorption by buying domestic goods and services, the multiplier effect is close to 1. If the central bank supports this fiscal expansion without raising interest rates, the additional demand increases inflation. However, if monetary authorities welcome this because inflation is below target and the economy is weak, the multiplier remains high. Transfers, on the other hand, have a smaller multiplier because it depends on who receives the money, whether they are liquidity constrained and likely to spend it. Government investment multipliers are larger because they can affect the supply side of the economy. In conclusion, our approach to fiscal policy analysis, whether for projects related to aging populations or for practical fiscal policy assessments, relies on macroeconomic frameworks like the GIMF. These frameworks help us evaluate fiscal packages by considering both demand-side effects, such as inflation, and supply-side effects, such as productivity improvements.